Today on Rebuilders, we are looking at what are the preconditions for renewal that we're seeing breaking out in our world.
Well, I'm still composing myself from the end of that one, Liddy. It's a classic probably Rebuilders in the sense that we start with a lot of sociological, cultural stuff. But I think at the end, the emotion came because I think the Spirit is speaking at this time. And the question we're really asking today is, what if we are on the brink of something? The story that we've been narrating for some time on this podcast, that others are narrating in the world. What if God is moving and we just need to be aware of it? What could be happening in this moment? I think it's a really important episode.
Yeah, very hope-filled. Let's get into it. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both today?
I'm very well.
Very well?
A bit cold.
Yes.
We'll turn the heater up.
We turn it on. I'm swell.
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 Yep.
How is the 1940s?
Don't talk to me about the 1940s, please.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you do want to listen to more
say.
of Daniel's
This isn't the podcast for it.
D-Day podcast.
We were briefly before we hit record looking at a Dutch windmill that's in, in Melbourne.
Yeah.
So for those listening, we have a migrant Dutch population in Melbourne, and there's a number of Dutch stores where you can buy different Dutch items, and some of them have windmills that they've built here. And also you can buy Dutch Omo washing powder.
Yeah, see, I would like to know about this because I'm a big Omo fan.
Yes.
Not sponsored, by the way.
And also Dutch
open
heritage as
Yes,
well.
yeah, quarter Dutch.
Yeah.
And I would like to try this Dutch Omo because I want to know if it's better than the Omo that I know and love.
Well, maybe we could do another sub-podcast series just comparing different, washing brands.
I was talking to Lindy who works with us here, who is half Dutch or something. We were talking about food, and she kind of made the observation that Dutch food is more known for its like kind of snacky, spreadable type of things, not necessarily its like main meal.
No, you got
things
your
that go
rusks,
around the meal.
You've got your salty licorice. You've got your stroop waffles.
Yeah.
They're good.
Yeah.
Well, hello also to our friends listening in the Netherlands, which, there are people listening there.
There
Hello to you.
Feel free to send us some Dutch Omo.
Yeah.
We'll see if it washes our clothes better.
No doubt. Well, who knows? We'll find out. Maybe. Okay, episode. Last week, we were chatting about the kind of switch that's happening in the world.
Yeah.
That the structures that we kind of placed our hope in, that we found our foundations in as societies are falling around us. But you also preface that there's something religious happening, and we're going to explore that a little bit more as we chat today.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot, and, I think there's definitely a mood at the moment of, are we surprisingly on the edge of some kind of Christian renewal, and obviously this has been a long-term subject of discussion on this podcast.
Yes.
And probably in some sense, prefacing, what, God's moved through history. He could do it again, reminding us of that. But I think we're finding ourselves in this sort of moment. There's a scene in Oppenheimer. I saw Oppenheimer for the first time recently.
Oh, yeah, I haven't watched it.
And
Good movie.
that someone has this scientific breakthrough where they're able to bad on science, and they read the paper, and then one of the people at the university then just goes and replicates the experiment, like it actually works,
Yes.
and I sort of feel like that there's this sort of theoretical sense, looking at church history, looking at the scripture. And, I think in my book, Reappearing Church, it's this theoretical paper of what if this moved? But now you're starting to see that, hang on, there's actually things happening which follow this. So I guess the big sort of topic is really, are we on the brink of a kind of revival and an outpouring, a renewal, whatever word you want to use? And I think how I would explain it is that I think we're in the preconditions that we're on the brink of something, and something is indeed happening. So I guess that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to take that apart, and what are the preconditions of revival and awakening, And are we seeing them? How does this work? And what would this look like? I just want to begin. Apologies if I mentioned this last week. I'm not sure that I did. But, I just had one of these moments in the last few weeks where I'm just like, man, something has fundamentally changed. Now, last week we talked a lot about how things have changed in the culture. Politically, there's this push towards extremism. And we looked at it really from a sort of, what's the broader culture dynamics. When I first started getting interested in looking at culture and how do we sort of do mission to the West, I remember reading articles about different key thinkers. And I remember, one person that I read about was Naomi Wolf, the feminist writer, subject of multiple sort of glowing articles. And I think she wrote a book called Invisible Bodies. And she was really a sort of, intellectual example of the sort of, new thinkers that were sort of coming of age in the late 90s, early 2000s, whatever. And, I remember her talking about, this sort of approach to life where she grew up in San Francisco and you sort of live this hedonistic life because San Francisco could be, taken over by an earthquake at any time. You sort of lived every day as if it was your last. And a few weeks ago, it just came up in my feed of a recommended podcast. And I listened to many different cultural podcasts and get all kinds of interesting things suggested to me. And what surprised me, it was Naomi Wolf being interviewing these sort of Pentecostal, how would I describe him? Pentecostal Messianic Jewish author, Rabbi Jonathan Cahn. And Jonathan Cahn is sort of, there's a lot of that sort of prophetic stuff, a lot of it sort of tied into American politics and stuff like that. And not someone I've read, but I was aware of him and that sort of space that he's in. And I thought, oh my goodness, on what planet is Naomi Wolf talking to Rabbi Jonathan Cahn? Now, Naomi Wolf, since that period of being sort of a lauded intellectual figure, sort of leading feminist, in a sense, has sort of been cancelled now. She sort of came out as an anti-vaxxer during COVID. I think she questioned a number of things around trans children, treating of, like medical interventions for trans children, and then just various other things sort of broke the orthodoxy of the age and has been cancelled. And Naomi Klein, who wrote the book No Logo, I think has written a book called Doppelganger about how people get them often wrong and, sort of charts the journey of what happened to Naomi Wolf. And in this, I thought I'm going to have to listen to this, not two people I'd necessarily listen to, but more just listen to it from a cultural perspective. And what was fascinating was Naomi Wolf talked about a number of things. And obviously she's sort of like changed her thought on a lot of things. But she talked about having an experience where Jesus appeared to her, which she still is trying to process, which is fascinating. Secondly, she talked about she'd read Jonathan Cahn's book, which is, I think it's called American Gods, where he sort of basically argues that what's happening at age is that some of the Old Testament sort of deities that the people around Israel and the Israelites themselves worshipped, like Moloch, he's arguing they're back.
It's called the Return of the Gods.
The Return of the Gods. Actually, American Gods, I think, is a Neil Gaiman novel, which is, I think, almost a similar theme. Not that I've read it. I'm sitting there listening, and basically what she says is, I read your book and all this stuff that I've experienced and gotten to this point that everything I'm seeing in the culture, I can only explain it through demons and the demonic. I thought this is absolutely fascinating. So the reason I use that example is the shift that is happening in people out there. There've always been prophetic sort of voices and Pentecostal voices like Jonathan Cahn, who have written books about, what does this mean, and Israel's doing this. There's always been those sort of books out there. That's not new. So I'm not surprised that a Jonathan Cahn exists. What I was surprised is that a Naomi Wolf, who formerly was rocking around the elite circles as a thought influencer, is now in a space where she's talking to this guy and going, the only way I can explain what's happening in the world is through demons. And I think for me, what that is, it's a revealing of something bigger that's happening out there. And I think one of the arguments I'm going to make in this podcast is, and I think I said this in last week, that if your way of measuring what mainstream opinion is through looking at mainstream sources that, or, like legacy media. So I'm not going to make some argument here like, the mainstream media sucks, man. Get away from the legacy media, get online. Like, I'm not making that argument. More what I'm saying is statistically that some of the sources that in 1997 or even 2013,
Yeah.
you would have looked at to see what is the public thinking, are now listened to by smaller and smaller amounts of people. The amount of people who listen to figures like Alex Jones or Joe Rogan and stuff like this is gargantuan. So I think there's a real danger for people in the church to buy a argument of really what is a shrinking set of people that are the elite thought shapers that were in a secular world. Now, I'll pause there. That's a big intro.
I mean, I probably have a couple of questions about that in terms of, well, if the church, sort of shouldn't be looking to these like legacy media outlets, where do they look for this kind of stuff? And maybe that's not something you want to answer now.
I will answer it.
Sure, why not?
So I just want to clarify again too, because I know how people can get things we say wrong. We've experienced that before.
Yeah.
So what I'm not saying is this is not a conversation about where do you go to get your news. One of the most asked questions of me is what news do you listen to? To everyone who sent me a message on Instagram, what news sources should I listen to? I apologize, I've not gotten back to all those messages. So I'm not saying you shouldn't listen to the BBC World Service and you should listen to Joe Rogan. I'm not saying that at all. I'm more saying like stepping back and what are people thinking out there. And I think there has been a kind of break that has happened in the world since 2016 that's intensified since the pandemic.
Sure.
And we have to get used to this because when you understand this break, you actually see the world in very, very different ways. I just want to read you a quote, and it's from The Guardian, and it's by Ross Barkan. I don't know if I read this last week or not, but I'll read it again. It says, we live in turbulent times now at the end of a pandemic that killed millions and for a period reordered existence as we knew it. It marked perhaps more than any other crisis in modern times, a new era, the world of the 2010s wrenched away for good. Now that's key. That is key. And I think I was hitting this last week and I was hitting it in a sociological sense. I want to hit it in a spiritual sense. The world of the 2010s, and the 2010s goes all the way to 2019, that's gone. We are, I think, moving out of grey zone. We're not fully out of grey zone. We've moved from grey zone phase 1 into grey zone, coming out of grey zone phase 2. A new world is taking shape and it's completely different to the world as it existed in 2018, 2019.
Yeah.
Barkan continues. A rebellion, both conscious and unconscious, has begun. It is happening both online and off. The off is where the youth one day might prefer to wage it. So what he's saying is there is this change happening out there in people, how they see the world. There's been this break. It was beginning, I think, since 2016 and obviously before that. But the pandemic was this accelerant. We've spoken about this before. But I think the further we get away from the pandemic, we see how it reordered society, but also reorder people's minds and how they think about things. So that's really sort of what I'm getting at today.
So I think just to briefly go back to the where do you get your news thing from, what you're saying is that the way that we used to, I guess, see what was happening in culture, shifting in culture, what the collective society was thinking was through these, classic news sources. You might go to New York Times or, here locally you'd read The Age and this is happening or, you just gave an example before when we were chatting, like you might watch The Simpsons and this is kind of narrating what's happening in culture.
Yes.
That is not where culture is reflected now.
Yes.
That's what you're kind of suggesting.
Yes.
So it's fine to read those things and watch those things, but it's not necessarily, as you might have in the past, been like, oh, this is reflecting what's happening in culture. It doesn't anymore. In fact, it's more separated from it.
Totally. And I'd even go as far as this. So, for example, the New York Times might be brilliant on reporting. I read an article in the New York Times recently about the conflict in Myanmar. New York Times is one of the few papers which can actually afford to have foreign correspondents. I think that's really important because otherwise these stories just completely drop off. Great reporting on the ground in Myanmar. It could be that some of these newspapers are better at reporting what's happening in foreign countries than even in their own populaces.
Yes.
And I think that what's happening is there is a mainstream mood out there which has changed radically. And for a lot of the gatekeepers of information to accept that would be shocking to them. because it goes against their own ideological bent. And I'm not talking here a right-left thing. And what I mean by that ideological bent is I remember, Disappearing Church, I wrote that, in that late 2010s period. And it was originally called The Beautiful Apocalypse, as in a revealing. And I remember being in Copenhagen, maybe 2010, 2011 or something, and being in this park, and it was summer, it was beautiful, and there's all these beautiful people, and people are hooking up on these apps. And on the plane, on the way home, I watched the movie Her, Spike Jonze's Her, or was that a bit after that? I can't remember. And the vision of Spike Jonze's Her is this utopian, beautiful future where people are slowly losing part of themselves to the technology, and he falls in love with the operating system on his phone. But the Los Angeles that it presented was one in which you didn't see homelessness on the streets. You didn't see social problems. It was sort of this beautiful, sun-drenched, people seemed nice and polite, yet it was rotting in its spiritual soul. That was the previous 2010s model of where we were heading. We were heading into this world where we're just sliding towards utopia, and the danger was that maybe we lose something of ourselves at a personal level in this journey towards a kind of utopia. So The Beautiful Apocalypse the title was, we're heading into an apocalypse that looks beautiful. And the apocalypse in the Greek, the revealing, is that at the core of that, our hearts have lost something.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people are still invested in that vision.
Yeah.
That we're sliding towards something beautiful. We spoke about this last week. So that's very much still an elite held view, and so a lot of the issues of justice and this is we can still get there. We've just got to try harder and we can control the information to help us get there. But I think there has been a profound break with that.
Yes.
And that's what we need to update, So again, I go back to that book, Disappearing Church. My thing was from relevance, because the church was trying to look like that as well.
Yes.
The sort of move in the church was increasingly cooler. It was the pastor bro, celebrity bro, the pastor type era. This hyper sort of millennial ascetic era. Something has radically changed now, and we need to adapt it, because this is about the next thing that God's going to do.
Well, with that in mind, let's sort of dive into a bit of a structure for today.
Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago, you gave a sermon at Red, and we're going to dive into some similar kind of areas that you did that week. So can I kick us off?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the structures which propped up atheism are failing.
Yeah. Okay, so last week we talked about plausibility structures, that society needs to have plausibility structures. Charles Taylor called the social imaginary. These are the different structures that people do, the rituals, the worldviews, the beliefs that hold the beliefs we have in place. And if you look at Peter Berger, I remember he had this line where he talked about even the Hasidic Jewish community in New York, they can live this separated lives, but when someone gets on the subway, they're still looking at the same ads and all this. So there's always this pressure from outside. And again, in that 2010s period, as secularism seemed to increase, it felt like that pressure, the seductive pressure of secularism just seemed to be growing. So the mood was very much, how do we sort of protect ourselves? How do we counterform people to these very strong formational ways of the culture? And so plausibility structures, I had friends who were looking at Peter Berger and looking at this stuff. How do we get this so that the people inside the church have how does the church have strong plausibility structures in regard to the strength, the seductive strength of the culture? What we didn't expect, and this has been a plot twist, even though people might say, didn't you say this, Mark? I think maybe I theoretically sort of sensed it, but I didn't realize how quickly this would happen is what is happening now is the plausibility structures of the culture are failing. Now, people might be shouting, oh, Mark, we've had all these celebrity pastors fall and people walking around from church and blah, blah. Yeah, that's all happened. The intertwining of politics and evangelicalism in America, all that stuff. Yes, that's all happening. I'm not arguing against that. But what we didn't expect was that the plausibility structures of the culture would begin to fall apart so quickly.
Yeah.
And what I'm arguing is in the mainstream out there, that has been almost like a psychological break that people have endured. And Naomi Wolf goes from, golden child of intellectualism 10, 20 years ago to cancelled and talking to Jonathan Kahn about demons, because there's been some psychological breaks where she's actually had failures of, like, it's almost that people in the culture are going through this own doubt period and deconstructionism. So the bigger trend is not deconstructionism in the church. The bigger trend is people who 10 years ago had a wholehearted faith in the culture's promises who are finding that belief deconstructed.
Yes.
And I don't think there's enough people marking that. That's partially what's happening at this point in time. I'll just give you an example. A few weeks ago, I saw it came up on social media. The story of a church somewhere in a school somewhere in America. I can't remember where it was. And basically there'd been a walkout of students because there are a number of students within the school who are living as their prime identity as animals. Mm-hmm. And there's a strong furry community in this school. Now, for people who don't know, furries are people who are a subculture of people who live in these sort of like almost like sports mascots, furry animal suits. It's a whole subculture. Some of that subculture put themselves in the LGBTQI coalition. And at this school, some of the students were complaining that the kids who were acting like animals were biting them. Mm-hmm. Right. So the bit that came up on my feed was an interview with a local furry, a member of the local furry community. So you can imagine a classic middle American news broadcast and, NBC 27, whatever, Wichita, I can't even remember where it was, in a park interviewing someone in a furry suit. And the sort of chyron down the bottom was chyron, whatever that's called. The writing down the bottom.
Yes.
Basically was like, local member of the furry community believes furries at school are giving a bad example of the furry community. And I sent it actually to a friend and I said, can you imagine showing this to someone in 1997? Yeah. And then I updated the text, I think, and I said, can you imagine showing this to someone in 2014?
Yeah.
Now, I don't think the average member, so the story that we've told for the last 10, 20 years is like society's changing, we're becoming more accepting, there's these different stuff.
Yep.
Are you looking that up, Daniel? I can see there's a smile on your face as you're deep diving.
Cruising an article.
That, society's becoming more progressive. The average broad society will accept this stuff. I think we're past a line here. I think the average punter, religious or not, out there sees that, even someone who probably thinks themselves as quite progressive goes, okay, this is a bit nuts. Like what on earth are we doing here?
Yeah.
I've seen in Melbourne, I've seen people walking in the streets in furry costumes, seen people in cars. It's out there. So there is a subculture doing this. But when stuff like that happens, it actually creates this moment of doubt and an undermining of the plausibility structures. Now, that's just one example. Mm-hmm. And so I think we've had multiple plausibility structure attacks, from COVID to the culture wars, to geopolitics, to living standards going down, to people going, I'm not going to be able to afford what my parents did. I can't buy a house. All of these things are the social contract that secular, progressive, utopian, Nancy Fraser calls it progressive neoliberalism. All these things, there's a breaks of trust and faith with it. And those are the things which propped up the last incarnation of atheism. This belief that you could live without God because the future is going to be better. You didn't need God. We're going to solve all the problems. Your life will just get better and better and better. That now is on incredibly shaky grounds, and that is a huge part of what is now happening. That's one of the key preconditions of a renewal.
Yeah. Well, so emerging from that, the spiritual and the mystical are returning.
Well, it's interesting. I'm going to read another quote from Barkin in the same thing. He continues on. So he talked about a rebellion that's happening, conscious and unconscious, after the pandemic. And he says this. He says the famed mantra, again, this is The Guardian. Okay, so this is not like a conservative newspaper.
Yep.
The famed mantra of the liberal left in the early months of the pandemic, trust the science, has faded from view. Instead, what can be loosely termed spirituality, a devotion to astrology, witchcraft, magic, and manifestation, has emerged particularly among the young. Online life, paradoxically enough, has only catalyzed this spirituality more, with teenage TikTok occultists and manifesting influencers racking up ever more followers. And what we're seeing in the culture is that as the belief in these things begins to fall, people begin to look to answers in other places. And so you're seeing throughout the culture, and again, too, it's not coming, I don't think, from top down. Like in the past, I remember there was the show The Craft was on, and people were like, oh, this is going to influence people. It's not coming top down where someone in Hollywood's like, here's a TV show. I rewatched The X-Files 2 years ago because I just had this sense that we're going to return to a moment like that. And I think we are, where there's this sense where, hang on, if I'm not trusting the structures and the promises given me by society, I'm going to start to look that, hang on, there could be something out there. You think the classic Fox Mulder thing, I want to believe, he had the big poster behind him in his FBI office. There is this sense that what Mulder and Scully actually stood for was the two coins. So Mulder and Scully, basically in the series, Fox Mulder's these sort of more, spiritually, supernatural hunting sort of skeptic who thinks that there's something more than just what the sort of institution's telling them.
Yes.
Scully is the rationalist, doctor background, FBI agent. So it's the two sides. You've got the Enlightenment scientific rationalism, and then you've got sort of the German romanticism, Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein at the limits of on a dark and stormy night in Lake Geneva with her friends. Those two sides are the two sides of Western modernity. And that mystical side is coming back because the promises are falling down in the culture. And again, but I'm saying this is coming not from Hollywood. This is coming from the ground up as people don't believe. So, for example, all the conversations about UAPs, UFOs, it's massive out there. This thing is massive. People talking about poltergeists and ghosts out there. This stuff is massive. Now, I'm not saying all of that stuff is true. People wanting to talk about the demonic who are not Christians. One thing I'm noticing is people who, I've got friends in very secular cities, are all of a sudden having people turning up and asking for spiritual deliverance from occultic forces. Like, this is a change in what's happening out there. Now, this comes at different times. So in the 90s, just referring to the X-Files, there was a move like this. We can talk about the 60s, the 70s. But what this is accompanying is, I don't think the institutions were as weak, and I don't think the social contract was as frayed as is currently happening now. The West was not in as weak a position as it currently is today. So you put those two things together, the spiritual and the mystical are returning. And the break that happened with COVID means people are willing to spiritually and intellectually go into places that they didn't feel comfortable going before.
Well, again, on that, the cultural value of Christianity is being reassessed.
I mean, there's been a number of articles about this. Daniel has referenced before Justin Brierley's series, The Rise and Fall of the New Atheism.
The surprising rebirth.
Sorry, the surprising. Sorry. I'm not good on details.
That's the first episode, that title.
There you go. Yeah, I can remember all these books that I read like 12 years ago, but I get the titles wrong. And basically really what Justin was tracking in that, and he wrote an article too in The Spectator, which we can link in the subscriber chats. If you want to subscribe, please do. And he talked about the fact that what you're seeing, particularly in the UK, this is also happening in Europe, in Scandinavia as well, is that you've seen a number of key people who've made unexpected conversions. And you've also seen a number of intellectuals who were perhaps 10 years ago quite anti-faith, and some of the members of the New Atheist movement, all of a sudden are either warming on Christianity. Richard Dawkins famously said a couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, he sort of called himself a cultural Christian now, and if we completely got rid of the Christian influence in Britain, that it wouldn't be a good thing. Tom Holland, the historian, wrote the book Dominion, which a lot of people have read. Louise Perry, the feminist, talk about the sort of utility of Christian stuff. Stephen Fry, who was very sort of open in his mocking of faith, is now, again, he's sort of talking like Dawkins, the elements of Christianity in the culture, and he's a ethnically Jewish atheist. Jordan Peterson, for all his flaws, introducing lots and lots of people to the concept of faith. I remember talking to someone a couple of years ago who was going to these like Facebook Jordan Peterson meetups in Australia and meeting all these people who had become Christians but were not in a church. And he was asking them, like, you realize probably Jordan Peterson is more of a Jungian? And they're like, yeah, we get that, but we've ended up at faith. Right. You see countries like Poland and Hungary and some of the countries in the sort of Visegrad bloc of the EU and Central Europe sort of almost deliberately adopting a sort of cultural Christianity against, the Western parts of the EU. You have this sense where the cultural value of Christianity is being reassessed, the sort of more that culture moves into this deconstructive path. Just a couple of nuances here. This is less happening in America as it is in Europe.
Okay.
America is more untangling a lot of what it sees as the sort of melding together of Christian nationalism.
Yes.
But that's not everyone's story. And, probably places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada in the Anglosphere, caught between the two, there's both stories happening. But particularly I think what you're seeing in Europe, there's this sense of, hang on, do we want to throw everything out here? And you're seeing people, if there's an Engel scale, for those who don't know what the Engel scale was, it's basically a missiological scale where if 0 is becoming a Christian and +5 is becoming a strong Christian, there's also like a +5 and a +10. So a -5 and a -10.
Yes.
So someone might move from -10 to -5 on their journey towards Christianity.
Yeah.
What we're seeing is people moving from, say, -10 to -3 and -2.
Yeah.
Another famous one, Nick Cave, growing up in Australia. I talked about this in the sermon that, I used to watch music videos late on night on a show we had called Rage, where they just played music videos all night. And Nick Cave was he's from Melbourne, part of a band called The Birthday Party, this post-punk band. And they had this clip that would come on, this music video called Nick the Stripper. And it was sort of Nick Cave, skinny as a rake because he was on heroin. I think he had in Latin on his chest written, God Pig.
Yeah.
And just seeing this going, oh my goodness, this is so spiritually dark. I'm still getting my head around the fact that I'm now watching interviews with Nick Cave where he's talking about his move towards faith, how he's going to church and how there's this sense that there's something in the liturgy and there's something, in God. Like that's a move on the Engel scales. Where is he now? I don't know exactly, but he's moved from -10 to perhaps -1, So this is happening out there. Again, you would not see this if you're just looking at the media. This is not breaking through because it's not the story. So the cultural value of Christianity is being reassessed. Now, there is a danger here, I just want to say as well. What we could see as the West goes further into sort of chaos is an attempt to reach for, and I think this is possibly what's happening in Central Europe, a reach for a cultural Christianity that's actually not with Christ at its center.
Yes.
It's tradition, it's culture, and it's sort of form without the fire, values without the theology. There's a real danger there. So you're hearing people like, I want the values, but do you want the theology as well? One indicator we're seeing in Australia is the amount of people putting their kids in Catholic schools, Christian schools, because they want the values. They don't want to go to church themselves.
Yes.
They don't want them in the state school system, but they want the values.
Yeah, interesting. Well, on that, I keep doing that. Everything's leading very well into the next thing. It's almost like you planned it.
Yeah.
Evangelism is back.
I think there was this mood from the 90s again to the 2010s where, hey, you believe that, Daniel, I believe this. Let's not push our stuff on each other. That's gone.
Yeah.
I was in Sydney recently and at the town hall, I saw something I'd not seen before, which was very enthusiastic Hindu street evangelists. Seen Islamic street evangelists, seen, Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, Church of Latter-day Saints. You go to Oxford Street in London, you'll see these teams of Islamic sort of proselytizers. Never seen Hindus before. And I'm not talking Hare Krishnas, I'm talking like mainstream Hindus. The world religions are out on the street converting people. This is a new thing. There is a sense where that others are seeing that the spiritual door is open and people are susceptible to change. There is a whole thing that's happened, hasn't been tracked heaps. So I haven't read an article on it. I've more been following the trend of lots of, since October the 7th in Gaza, there's lots of very progressive people online converting to Islam. And a lot of women converting to Islam. Famously on the right, Andrew Tate has converted to Islam. So conversion is starting to happen. That's a sign of breaks. And if you look at these different key periods in history, you could look at late antiquity, you could look at earlier, in the sort of that Dark Ages period. You could look at the 18th century. There's these periods where people start to change, and this is another evidence of that sort of break. And I think what we're moving from is from don't push your beliefs on me world to a constant attempts at conversion. What's a culture war? A culture war is people continually trying to convert you to their ideological viewpoint. Now, if you broaden out in the tradition of Newbegin, you said, religion's actually what we truly sort of act out and believe versus just a narrow belief in a supernatural deity. We're in a continually religious space. It's not like the liberalism of days past, where it's like, I'm going to do my thing, you're going to do your thing. Maybe that exists in parts of Scandinavia, still in some parts of the world. But we've moved to a much more forward-facing, aggressive, whereas my political beliefs, my cultural beliefs, my religious beliefs, I'm here to convince you. And there's conversation. I think a lot of people feel uncomfortable now and feel like the culture was exhausting, because what they don't realize is actually a conversion space. Everyone's trying to convert everyone all the time. So it's actually back. The church has got to realize that it's almost like, hey, everyone's welcome. Just come, be yourself. Come to our church. We accept everyone. That's going to be interpreted different this side of the pandemic than it was before.
Okay, sure.
People will come to your church trying to change what you think. They're coming to your church. They want sometimes you to align to their beliefs. There's a lot more openness out there. It's all shifting.
Interesting. So your next point is that organized religion is returning, and I'm curious about this one.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I'm noticing as well is I mentioned Tom Holland before. I just saw before I got on Instagram, there was a little Instagram post from the Leadership Conference, which is currently happening in London. They had Tom Holland speak at the Royal Albert Hall. I was there last year, and Tom Holland spoke this year. And there was just this quote from Tom Holland. This is fascinating. Again, I don't think he's said that he's fully become Christian. He's moved on that Engel scale. He's had some spiritual experiences. But he said, the church in culture at the moment does not just have to give as its message a whole slushy version of what the world's saying. I thought, well, that's really interesting. I think that there is this sense where the dominant, since the 1960s, again to the 2010s, has been this idea that people want spirituality, not religion. Reading Nick Cave, again, what's fascinating is he's almost bagging out spirituality, and he's like, no, you need the sort of bums on seats turning up every week, going through the liturgy, like form of religion. We're seeing people who are converting to Christianity. They're sort of turning to orthodox forms of, or they're turning to orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy. They're becoming traditional Roman Catholics. The ones that are joining Protestants, they're becoming sort of Orthodox, I'd say small O Orthodox evangelicals. There is something that the people are actually converting. They're not wanting to convert to something that just looks like the world. I think this idea, again, in the 2010s of like, we'll offer you faith and it's cool like the world, and we're going to all use the HR buzzwords of the world, whether they're right or left-wing versions of them. People are not looking for that. They're actually looking for something different. In the sermon, I had a quote from Paul Kingsworth, who is a novelist, British novelist, former atheist. He converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. But he just said this, it's interesting. He says, Western culture seems in many ways to be visibly collapsing before our eyes. I was going to pause there. If Western culture, if you feel that the culture is collapsing, that either it's incredibly corrupt or it's being deconstructed, whether you come from the left or the right, whatever you come on that, you don't want a faith that then is just like that culture. Like, what's the point? So anyway, continue on. It says, our nations, our family structures, our communities, our assumptions, our ecosystems, everything is under strain, under attack, or bursting at the seams. I think this is all just a form of temporary displacement activity. I think the real story is that our religious sensibility is slowly revealing itself to us again. Emerging, blinking into the light, our instincts are trying to return to their source. On some level, perhaps we know this, but we are holding it off as long as possible, because to turn around and look into the light would be to accept that our whole culture has been trailing down a dead-end road since the Enlightenment. We can't look at that fact, so we look at absolutely everything else instead, but the confrontation can't be put off forever. The biggest lie my culture told me was that matter was dead along with God and that humans could reason their way to freedom. Reason has its uses. It's a gift we're given and we should wield it like technology as wisely as we can. But at root, humans are fundamentally spiritual animals. The future is not atheists in space. I think that's an Elon Musk dig. The future, like the past, will be religious. What I love about that quote, even he's talking about the religious sensibility is slowly revealing itself to us again. Most people listening will be familiar with my grey zone metaphor, that we've headed into this grey zone. And if you think about grey zone, it's a murky light. And I think what he's saying is that grey zone initially, the first phase of it's like it's displacing. How do we fit? What does the church do here? The 2010s are not coming back. How do we find a place? The old markers don't work. But actually in the midst of this place, the religious is starting to return. And it's like the light is turning back on again. It's not a bright light which fills the whole room, but it's almost emerging from the murk at this time. So we're now hitting the religious phase of the grey zone.
Fascinating. So ultimately, people are seeking.
People are seeking. Can I just add one more thing too? I just want to add something too that David Thomas said after the Asbury outpouring. He said what he realised too is Gen Z wanted moral clarity. In a world with no moral clarity, they're looking for moral clarity. And I think that's, again, like people are seeking the robust, proper stuff.
Yes.
You know, they're not, I like that slushy word from Tom Holland. They're not looking for just slushy HR slogans, which so much of the church has become, and are not just the liberals.
Yeah.
You know, like it's like just throw out the buzzwords out here. Like they're looking for something different. And I think part of the reason that Asbury caught the media's attention and is because it actually was a moment of faith building for us.
Yes.
But actually it was a shocking thing to lots of people who've been told that Gen Z was the ones who are going to walk away from religion.
Yeah.
And to see them running towards it, again, that's another thing where it's like the plausibility structures start to wobble.
Yes. Was there anything further you wanted to say on people seeking?
Okay, so we've talked very high level here. We've quoted articles, the Spectator article, Justin Rowley was spoken about. There was another great article since I did this sermon in the Times, James Marriott. It was on the 1st of May in London. And, you know, he talked about that London, all of a sudden, the young are looking religious, you know, and had this great little bit at the end. He talked about walking past, I think it's St. John's in Hackney, which is St. Church run by Al Gordon, friend, and you know, he talked about for years walking past this building and wondering if, you know, just a relic of the past, this beautiful building, London's history. And he went in and sees this alive church, and it is. Interesting that article was published on May the 1st, which is actually at the moment when the Awakening Project, which is David Thomas, some of your friends we've had on the podcast, Pete Gregg was there, Sarah Bruhl, Pete Hughes, Al Gordon, you know, these people in one building worshiping God. And you know, that's pretty interesting that the Times of London are noticing that is happening. And he has this great line in there. So I thought this was a relic of the past, but what if this is a vision of the future? That's not just a story that's happening to those people in London. This isn't just an Asbury story. This isn't just a saint in London story. After I gave this sermon, I had multiple people coming up to me going, I've been talking to this person about faith for 10 years and they weren't interested, but in the last 2 years, they're all of a sudden interested.
Yeah.
This person not interested in anything, I've just given them a Bible. Crazy. I can't share all the stuff, you know, because some sort of confidential, but people who are going like the people who I thought would be the most resistant to faith have had radical conversions.
Yeah.
And we're having, you know, people outside the church having dreams. There are people who like people from with other faith who all of a sudden have a dream of Jesus and come and ask them about it. You know, there is conversions happening. There's stuff going on. There's something out there that is currently occurring. Is there the story of people walking away? Yes. Was in many ways 2020 for cultural Christianity carnage? 100%, particularly in the US. I'm just going to say that. But that's not the only story out there. That there's also something happening. And maybe what's actually happening is cultural Christians, many of them are walking away from the church at the exact moment that people who have lived in the world for many years and found it lacking are coming towards the church. I was talking about some of this before I preached this sermon with a friend, and he was just telling me some crazy stuff. He's in a secular city, and he's just telling me some crazy stories, and I could just see this hope in him. And he just said this line to me and it just grabbed me. He goes, Mark, aren't you glad we stayed in? And like it hit me. I knew everything intellectually that we were talking about. I could give you the sociology just as I've done now. But there was just something there. And he said, like, what if, basically I think what he's saying is like, what if this is the reward for hanging in? I know a lot of you who listen to this podcast, we've had the emails, we've had the feedback. This has been a lifeline, really for the last few years since COVID. I know many people on here got absolutely smashed, lost friends, people walked away from church. Many of you wondered about hanging in. I know many of you are in secular employment as well. Is there such a thing as secular employment? It's all under the lordship of Christ. But, non-paid ministry employment, found yourself in really difficult places where you felt like you're walking a tightrope between when are you compromising, when are you not. All listeners of this podcast who've been listening for a while have gone with us on a journey, and at times where perhaps this has been, a soul solace to you, keeping you going. What if, my friend's word is to you as well? What if you've hung on because he's wanted to prepare you for what comes next? And I think renewal and awakening has to be stewarded. And it has to be stewarded by those who have actually walked through it and invested and sown the seeds. And part of that sowing the seeds is sometimes just continual plodding and persevering and moving forward. Holiness comes when renewal happens. And God takes us through preparation so we can be prepared to hold on to that holiness, the presence that comes at those moments. I just want to say, I think that we're also in this moment, there's a handing over of the baton. I think about this period and, emotions. Classic rebuilders, from intellectual stuff to emotions. I'm banging on the table there to compose myself. Earlier this morning, was reading an old paper from Tim Keller. And I thought about it, and I just thought, there's been a baton handing. Tim Keller, the greats of the last generation, he's not with us anymore. And in moments like this, God hands across the baton to the next people. He's not going to hand it to the people who have the best positional power. He's not going to hand it to the people with the most Instagram followers, the best looking people who have been able to look to the world like they've done it all, to the standards of the world. What he does at moments like this is he hands it to those who have shown trustworthiness, faithfulness in really difficult seasons. And I know there's so many of you listening. And so what if actually we're about to head into a season where God starts to move in really profound ways? We have to prepare. So is this going to be everyone? No. But I know that out there listening across the world to this podcast and this platform that God has given us to use, and we use it humbly, it's really just to encourage you. Get with those who feel a similar heart. Pray. And let's actually change how we're seeing the world. People are hungry. The secular myth is that people don't want God anymore. They do. They're hungry. They're out there. And what they're looking for is a church which is filled with the presence of God, which is just centering itself around simple things, not simplistic, simple things, not filled with people who are pursuing platform, but people who are hungry, searching after God. Doesn't matter whether you're a Pentecostal church, a Reformed church, a small Catholic community, whatever the heck you are, does not matter. It's actually, are you centering around those things? There is a season, and just to end with Jesus' words, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Let's be the workers for this time. And let's step into the invitation of this season.
Amen.